involves some data dependencies, which is why we iterate over the space that way. You saw the blue wave sort of propagate through the cube. Everything in blue can be computed in parallel at any given wavefront iteration step, but it relies on upstream data in order to perform that computation. So we have a complex data dependency here where we have some parallelism, but we can't just simply parallelize all three of our dimensions without any concern. There are some dependencies that need to be taken into consideration. So more specifically, the way it works in Minisweep, outlined by this figure, is if we were starting in our top left corner with our yellow cube, every cube that's being computed, we call them grid cells, every grid cell that's being computed by Minisweep relies on its upstream neighbors exactly one space behind. So that can be up to 3 grid cells per grid cell being computed. So in this case, we would compute our yellow grid cell first, then we'd move on to the 3 green grid cells, and they would rely on the data computed by the result of the yellow grid cell, and so on and so forth. With the blue grid cells would rely on the green grid cells, etc., and we'd propagate through our 3-dimensional space this way. So this is what I'm talking about when I refer to a wavefront. And just to kind of give you a clear picture of how this would work, this is a 2-dimensional example, but every node here of a given number can be computed in parallel. So node 1 would be computed first, and then both the nodes that are marked 2 rely on the information from node 1, but they don't have any data dependencies across each other, so they can be computed in parallel, so on and so forth. So that's how we get this sort of diagonal behavior of a wavefront code. And Minisweep is a little more complex because we have 3-dimensional space that we're exploring. So we have X, Y, Z dimensions, and then we have I have energy groups and angles here, which basically are the components of the in-grid cell computation. So at each one of these grid cells, we're not computing one thing; we're computing a collection of things. So there's a collection of particles in each unit of space, and we have to do some computation on each one of those. So when we approach this problem, we see basically at a high level 5 nested loops, and I know that I'm going to be using OpenACC for this particular work. And OpenACC currently, the PGI's implementation only really offers 2 levels of parallelism, gang and vector. The worker clause is not working properly, and I can explain that to you later if you offline if you want to know exactly what was happening. It's a little complicated, but I do have a bug report submitted with them, and it will be fixed. But for all intents and purposes, when we were doing this work, we could really only rely on the gang and vector clauses. And like I mentioned earlier, there is an upstream data dependency in our spatial dimensions. So then I started thinking about, okay, how are we going to map this to a GPU, right? This is a diagram of, I believe this is a GTX 1080 from NVIDIA, of what a GPU looks like. And basically what I wanted to highlight is we have 2 layers of parallelism that are exposed to us with OpenACC. So the first is the gang level. So what I have circled in red here is an SM, which stands for Streaming Multiprocessor, which is your GPU is laid out into a number of SMs, each with a number of cores inside of them that you can think of as vector threads. So when you're using OpenACC and you say, hey, I want to parallelize something at the gang level, it's going to actually split that particular loop into blocks, which are going to run across SMs, and then your vector computation that would happen inside of each gang would then be parallelized across the cores within one of those SMs. So back to the wavefront algorithm, how do we actually map this to our particular algorithm that we're talking about today? So this has been sort of an ongoing issue since the 90s, parallelizing these types of sweep algorithms. And the accepted solution is something called the KBA method, which is an acronym referring to Cook, Baker, and Alcouf, who actually developed the algorithm in 1992 at Los Alamos National Lab and published a paper on it that talked about parallelizing a sweep algorithm that overcomes the data dependencies using a wavefront, so doing this sort of diagonal iteration and parallelizing along each one of those wavefront iterations. But all the existing solutions out there right now involve some kind of manual code transformations. And this is the kind of thing that we want to get away from, because as these parallel patterns get more and more complex, that's going to require more manual rewrites and more intervention from the programmer, and not really going to have a truly portable solution if for every new architecture that comes out you still have to be messing around with restructuring your loop nest in such a way that you can map to that particular hardware. There are polyhedral frameworks in existence that support these kinds of support automating these kinds of transformations, such as Chill Framework and Pluto. But they have some limitations. They only support affine loop transformations. You have to know not only what your fixed loop bounds are that can't change, but there can't be any sort of aliasing going on or anything like that in order for their compiler to handle this properly. And they are experimental, and you would have to implement sort of within the scope of that framework. There is currently no solution in any widely used high-level languages like OpenMP or OpenACC for wavefront type codes. So we'd like to change that, since this type of data dependency does occur in a wide range of scientific applications, not just limited to radiation transport codes. So we want to, as I mentioned, we want to create an abstraction for this wavefront pattern. So we need to do a couple things in order to do that. We need to analyze the flow of data and computation in wavefront codes. We need to think about the memory and threading challenges associated with those data and computational dependencies. And then we need to come up with a way to actually automate the transformation of these loops. So when I initially looked at this code, it looked something like this, which is relatively straightforward, where we're iterating across all three of our spatial dimensions, and then we have our energy and angle in-grid cell computations that happen within each unit of space. And unfortunately, what I ended up having to do was actually completely transforming the outer three dimensions of this loop nest to iterate over a number of wavefronts. The number of wavefronts can be calculated as a function of the size of the three dimensions, parallelizing over two of those dimensions, and then solving for my third dimension, at which point I check to make sure that I'm actually at a grid cell lying along that wavefront in order to perform computation. And that allowed me to parallelize this in a high-level manner. I put that in air quotes because it still was kind of complicated and required some code transformation. As I mentioned, there is no existing abstraction for this. So what we're focusing on is the parallelization of the spatial decomposition. The in-grid cell computations do not have data dependencies. So within a given grid cell, you have an embarrassingly parallel computation. This is simple. I do have a note here that they are application specific. So we have this notion of particles and directions of those particles in Minisweep because of the nature of the simulation being run. But wavefront codes in other domains can have completely different in-grid cell computations and a varying amount of it as well. So we want to focus on these upstream data dependencies in the spatial dimension. And I have a note here that there's a slight variation between wavefront applications, because in our particular case, we're only looking at our immediately preceding neighbors, but that might not be the case for all wavefront codes. Specifically, the Smith-Waterman gene sequencing algorithm looks farther upstream than Minisweep would. So this is something we need to consider as well. So that leads us to thinking about a data model. So for Minisweep, we don't necessarily need to store all previous wavefronts, because we only need the one immediately preceding neighbor to any given grid cell being computed along the wavefront. In theory, you could limit your data structure that you're storing these in to be the size of the largest wavefront, which would be when you hit the middle of the cube, when the wavefront is the largest. That would be optimal, but not practical, because now you're introducing a layer of computation in regards to, based on where I am, how do I compute the correct value to grab the neighbor that I need, and I now have this one-dimensional array that's not of the same size of any of my dimensions, and it can get a little bit confusing. So we used something that we called face arrays, which are basically a flattened two-dimensional array in each upstream direction. So we have 3 of them. And basically what I can say is, okay, if I need the neighbor in, to x minus 1, y minus 1, I would just access that face array at x minus 1, y minus 1. So we're storing a little more data than we need, but it makes our indexing really easy and doesn't add any additional computational overhead. You can think of that as in each upstream direction for any given grid cell, you would have a two-dimensional plane that's sort of flattened across each end of this cube that we talked about earlier. So some limitations of existing programming models. Like I said, there's no abstraction for wavefront loop transformation, so I had to do some manual loop restructuring here, and I had limited layers of parallelism, so 2 isn't enough. My worker clause is broken, so I only have gang and vector, and I have asynchronous execution noted here because Minisweep doesn't actually run one sweep, it runs 8. So what it does is it actually runs one sweep starting at every single corner of the 3-dimensional space that we're exploring. Those sweeps are also parallelizable, but how do we do that if our programming model only actually gives us 2 layers of parallelism? So my preliminary solution to that is to asynchronously launch kernels, use asynchronous parallel regions in OpenACC. But it would be nice if we had a more elegant way to do that. So I'm going to show you some results from my experiments. We used a variety of different machines because we wanted to demonstrate a portable solution. So we used NVIDIA's Professional Services Group cluster, which has a number of different kinds of nodes. Specifically, the ones that I used had Tesla P100 and V100 GPUs, and for legacy purposes, I tested on their K40 nodes as well for backwards compatibility. I also ran on Oak Ridge's Titan supercomputer, which has AMD CPUs and NVIDIA K20X GPUs. And I ran on Summit Dev, which was the development cluster that's supposed to be representative of what Summit now looks like. At the time, Summit wasn't built yet, so it has IBM Power 8 processors, NVIDIA P100 GPUs, and there are 4 GPUs per node in that particular machine. And the same goes for a PSG cluster as well, 4 GPUs per node. We're using PGI's compiler 17.10, which was the community edition at the time. The current community edition is actually 18.4 that they released in April. And we use for OpenMP, we use GTC 6.2 because that's what Oak Ridge was using to compile their OpenMP 3.1 implementation. I did have some issues running that on Titan, but it worked okay on PSG, so I have some results for that. My input parameters, so the size of my simulation, my XYZ dimensions are set at 64. There are 64 energy groups and 32 angular directions for each energy group. The reason that I chose those sizes is because that is representative of what I was told would be run at Oak Ridge. So that basically 64 energy groups and 32 angles per energy group are about as big as the simulation is going to get in terms of in-grid cell computation. But they want to be able to blow up the spatial dimension as big as possible to either model a bigger space or to get some finer granularity within a fixed